So we are in the second week of a series we're calling Fake News, and here's where we're going. We're trying to discuss just a little bit the impact of the culture around us on our faith or the issues of faith, because it is a growing problem. In 2016, Oxford Dictionary made post-truth the word of the year. That was their word of the year. That, in other words, the word that got looked up the most, talked about the most, the word that seemed to grow in truth or grow in its search was this combination of words, post-truth. Now, something is true if it's in accordance with fact or reality, right? Something is true if it goes along with facts or reality. That's how we know truth. But this idea of post-truth is different because at one point in time, post, you could put the prefix post on anything and it would mean after, right? So post-war, after the war, post-surgery, after your surgery, post-Super Bowl, something we're not familiar with in Dallas right now. But you put post on something and it literally means after, but not anymore, or at least not in this case. To be post-truth is to talk about a time where truth is no longer influential the way it used to be. So here's what I want you to write down. Post-truth is this: objective facts are less influential than opinions or personal beliefs. It's this period we've entered where opinions and personal beliefs are trumping, if you will, no pun intended, facts. And we can joke about this and we can play with this, but this is creating a whole new surge in our culture, right? The idea of the flat earth is back with a vengeance. Now, I find this hard to believe, but you can go online and there are growing groups of people who are convinced the earth is flat. It's almost as if you can't show them enough evidence. There's this conspiracy mindset that is behind everything. Now, look, I get it. Okay, I'm trying not to be political this morning, but we have to talk about some things. And the hard truth is we are living in a post-truth culture. And now, unfortunately, my personal belief or opinions are trumping facts these days. So you get things like Pizzagate. Anybody remember this? Where Hillary Clinton was supposedly in business with a group that was selling young children into sex slavery out of a pizza restaurant. And this thing breaks, this story breaks, and what happens? A guy shows up at the pizza place with a gun ready to confront everybody. And the reality is he just scared a whole bunch of pizza workers that day. They're thinking, I'm changing my profession. I thought I was in the safest profession around, right? Or we get things like that President Obama started ISIS, or that President Bush actually was behind the whole 9/11 attacks. Now, please, I run the risk of offending everybody at sometimes, and I just need to push your buttons a little bit. The problem today is we're paying less attention to facts, and we're paying more attention to the things that stir up our passions, the things that stir up these personal beliefs. And we're creating a culture that makes it hard to even get along. If you're a doctor today, I don't know, some of you know this, and when I was in college, I was pre-med, in the pre-med program. I would not want to be a doctor today. Because every patient that walks through the door, and maybe you do this, you walk through the door and you already know what's wrong with you. You just need to go to the doctor to get the stamp of approval, right? To get the medicine. Like doctors, they're having to train doctors today to gently reveal test results. We're doing this. It used to be doctors were scrambling, trying to figure out how to learn to discern what's wrong with a patient, to learn the symptoms, to learn how the system of the body works. But now we're trying to figure out how to gently break news to somebody because they're convinced of things they have. They've self-diagnosed. This is a post-truth culture, and it's radically changing how we interact. In fact, here's the problem. If we're confused about what we really believe is true in culture, in life, then it's going to change how we describe what's true. Think about that. If we are confused about what really is true, right, then it's going to change how we describe truth or what we believe is true. Illustration. You ever as a kid play that telephone game? You know the game where you sit in a giant circle? Maybe you did this at the playground at school, and somebody starts a phrase or says something and they whisper it in the ear to the person next to them. It goes all the way around the circle. And of course, by the time it gets back to the last person, it's not even close to what you originally said. Right? It's a fun game, but that's not how we should live life, right? Like if that's what we trust, if that kind of misinformation is what we base our life on, it's going to get really, really hard to live life in an effective way. I read a story this week about a mom who was talking to her young son, and he was demanding that they have another baby. And apparently she decided that she'd try a different line of conversation. She said, so, son, do you know where the babies come from? And he said, yes, I know where they come from. And she was a little shocked. She said, well, tell me where you think babies come from. He said, well, Costco. That's bad truth, right? Like you don't want to go to the doctor if you're pregnant and your doctor believes that you get babies from Costco. That would not work out well. But that's the culture we're in. Post-truth. That my personal desires, my opinions are actually mattering more than the truth that we have around us, right? It's altered everything for us. So when I say to you this morning that we're going to dive in just a little bit and look at what Jesus talks about when he talks about God. See, some of you, I'm afraid I'm going to lose you right there because you're already asking the question, but how do I know I can trust Jesus, right? Like you keep talking about this post-truth generation and we're living in it and there's all these questions out there about the person of Jesus. Maybe you want to know, was he even real? How do we know we can trust what he said? Go back and listen to last week. We talked a lot about the Bible and the sources that are out there. Actually, we talked a little bit, but go back and listen. We talked about how there is a reliability with the scriptures that doesn't exist with really any other book on the face of the planet. What I mean by that is you can go back to the sources and you can get so close to the original writing of the scriptures and you can follow it through hundreds and thousands of manuscripts down through the last couple of thousand years, and what you're going to find is it's stayed the same. Yeah, we argue about some words and translating certain words, but the concepts are all there. It's not been altered. The dates haven't been changed. Names haven't been moved around. It's reliable. It's trustworthy. Now, you may not be there yet, but that's what we're working off of. And we're doing that because I told you last week, if you don't have a source, if we don't have a source to look to about who Jesus Christ really is, what's going to happen? We're all going to look to ourselves. We're going to look to the things that we find on the interweb, right? We're going to look to the things that we heard way back in college or yesterday with some friends out for dinner. We're going to have all of these opinions we bring to the table, and the problem is we need a source. So we are going to go to the scriptures this morning. And I'm just kind of begging you to stay with me on this thing. Stay with me and ask the hard questions. See, I don't think God's intimidated by your hard questions. I think he can tolerate hard questions. So ask him the hard question, but don't ask him the question if you're not willing to go look. And let's look at the source. So we're going to jump into the source, and you're already going to notice something. I'm going to tell you this before I get there, but I couldn't get all the verses in this morning. So that means we're probably here for 3 hours. But I just put the references so you can go home and look them up this week, right? But I just couldn't get them all printed. So let's talk about Jesus for just a second. Before we look at what he said, let's talk about him as a person. And we're going to spend a little bit of time here. Because he grew up in one of the most unique times probably in the history of man. The people around where he grew up, in that Galilean area, were some of the most religious that have existed. And what I mean by that is these were Jews that were committed to the Torah. They were committed to the Old Testament, the laws and commands of Moses, the ways of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the patriarchs that you hear about and read about in the scriptures. They studied it. Their whole educational system pushed them to know the scriptures. And as they grew up, these people would debate. They would talk. They would hash it out. They had lots of conversations about what, who, and where God was at in the world. And this was what they did. So in this area, their educational system actually was meant to produce disciples of God. That's all. You know, we have schools today and we can put our kids on different tracks. In fact, I love the schools in our area because kids can choose to do a math track or a science track or a biology track or an English track or whatever. Kids can choose these different ways to study through high school and already start prepping for college and life. They had one prep. It was simply that you become a disciple of God. That's what they did. And you went to a rabbi to do that. And as you grew up, we'll talk about that in just a second, but as you grew, the rabbis that would grow up through the system, the ones that were the best of the students, to become the next level of rabbis, they would be called Talmudim. They would be called disciples. And to be a Talmudim, to be a disciple, was to actually, they had a phrase for it, to walk in the dust of the rabbi. See, the whole goal of their educational system was that the best of the best, to become disciples, to become teachers of the law, would walk so closely with the rabbi that they didn't just know what he knew. They would eventually start to act as he would act. They would eventually start to discern the way he would discern. That all the scriptures and all his wisdom and all his knowledge would be so heavy on a student that it's as if he stood so close to that rabbi that when the rabbi walked, the dust of his feet would come over and settle on the dust of the student. We don't think like that today, right? Like when I say disciple, in the West, we think of a student. We think of an educational system. And for us in the West, that means I've got to know what I got to know. I got to study real hard, so I got to take a test, regurgitate the information. And that information might be very helpful one day, but it's information. When Jesus walked the earth in his community with what God was doing at the time, it wasn't just knowing, it was could you do it as well. It wasn't just about learning the information, gathering information, storing information, regurgitating information. It was could you be just like the rabbi? Could you walk so closely that his dust would settle on you? You know, if you've ever been to the beach, have you done that and you walk the beach in a really good sandy beach? Chances are the sand gets on your feet and you end up flipping it on yourself or flipping it on other people. That's what they're talking about. That you just walk that closely. It's not about regurgitation of information. It's about understanding and doing something with it. So a Jewish disciple went through a really rigid system. This is what Jesus grew up in. Today, it's just not that way. In Jesus' day, at age 5, they would enter something called Beth Sefer. That was more like our elementary school. That's at age 5. Now, by the time they got to about age 12, that meant they had the first 5 books of the Bible memorized. Anybody got the first 5 verses memorized? Raise your hand. Go ahead. We're going to take time. We're going to all say those out loud, right? Like, not just for first 5 verses, the first 5 books, Matthew. That's the wrong section. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They had the first 5 books completely memorized by the time they were age 12. Now you think about that and you think, well, what's the significance? At 12, here's what would happen. The best of the boys, and I'll apologize for this in a second, but the best of the boys would go on, if they could, to Beth Talmud. And this is where they would begin to learn to interpret, to argue, to handle the scriptures, and to be able to state with an authoritative voice what somebody should do, how they should live. But for most boys and girls, at 12, they would go back to their parents' home. They would begin to learn whatever the family trade was. Girls would learn a lot about the house. Boys would learn about carpentry, taking care of livestock, whatever it is Dad did. Now, this is interesting because we see some key markers in the life of Jesus. I want you to go to Luke 2 for just a second. I did put this one in your flyer. Luke 2, verse 41. It's talking about Jesus. He's a child. It says, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year for the feast of the Passover. This is what every Jew would do. And when Jesus was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom. And when the feast ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't know it. But supposing him to be with the group, they went a day's journey. But when they began to search for him among the relatives and acquaintances, and when they didn't find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. This is going to sound really foreign to you parents, right? Because today we have leashes that we keep our kids on when we go out in public, and I used to be really against that. Now I'm not so much because there's crazy stuff, right? But they traveled as family units. So and this could have been 100 or more people. So for Jesus to kind of not be in their sight was not a big deal. To go a day's journey was not a big deal. And he was 12 years old. He was entering that manhood phase. And so it's just not a big deal. There was nothing bad happening here. But when they finally, it says, verse 45, when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. Verse 46, after 3 days, they found him in the temple. 3 days, parents, 3 days searching. No internet, child alert. They didn't have those highway signs, right? Couldn't send out any alerts. They're searching for him, verse 46. And they found him sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Verse 47, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. He was 12 years old. 12 is the age he would have known the Torah, but 12 is the age he's supposed to go home. He's supposed to learn his daddy's trade. He's supposed to, if he's good enough, he'll be invited by a rabbi to become that Talmudim, to make it to the next level. But that's years. A practicing rabbi didn't start practicing until he was 30 years old. That's when he had what they would call shmikah. He would have authority. He would have power. Jesus is 12. The time when he's supposed to go home, and he's sitting there, and they're thinking, what's going on? How does this kid know so much? Now, I put a little note in my notes because about this time I can feel everybody going, oh, what about the ladies? Listen, I want to say something to you because we miss a lot of this and we get offended and people argue about the Old Testament. Look, just because women were not allowed in school past the age of 12, here's what's going on. It was a cultural issue. That does not mean God has ordained women to not go to school, right? I just feel like I need to say that because sometimes we look at the Old Testament and it is heavy-handed. It is heavy-handed with the male rule, and that does not mean that God favored that. God always enters a culture where that culture is at, and he's trying to teach us and push us forward. So you need to know that. This is not one of those things, oh, the women just weren't good enough, so we got to let them take care of the house, guys. And if you think like that, it's going to mess up your marriage. So don't think like that. But it's not just a coincidence that at 12, Jesus is now teaching, because now at 30, well, we don't find out a lot about Jesus from 12 to 30, but all of a sudden he goes to 30, and what happens? He shows up at the exact same time that a rabbi would start to teach, and he starts to talk and teach, and he starts to instruct, and he does his first miracles at age 30. Now you can imagine what's going on. In fact, this one verse, I made sure that I got it in there today because I bet most of you have never seen this verse, or if you've read over it, you've read really quickly. That Jesus began to teach, and he started to talk, and he started to do miracles, but listen, it wasn't like everybody just all of a sudden said, oh, he's the one. In fact, I love John 7, verse 5. It says, for not even his brothers believed him. See, he faced opposition. His own family thought he was crazy. Right? I can just imagine if I had gone home at age 30 and said to my siblings, hey, got some big news today. I'm the one. Like, I'm the guy you've been waiting on. I'm the guy that we've been talking about, we've been studying about. We went to Beth Sefer until we were 12. We studied all the Old Testament. I'm the one. I'm the Messiah. Jesus was clear. We're going to see in a second. He was clear on who he was, but you need to make sure that you understand it didn't just happen like that. His own brothers didn't believe. His own family had questions, right? So now, what did Jesus teach? What did Jesus begin to teach his disciples about God that I think sometimes we miss today? I want to look at three different things real quick. I want to look at three different things, three different passages, and I want you to see, first of all, why I trust Jesus, right? Because he is who he says he is. We have this history, we have this language, we have it built up. We can talk more about this. We just can't cover it all today. But we have these signs. We see how it fits into the culture, right? And as he's talking, there's at least three passages I find that I look at it and I go, he's trying to help us understand more about who God is. But if we're not clear, we're not going to know how to believe in God. John 14, let's go there first. Look on the screens or your, I don't mind. You guys know that. Pull up your iPhones if you want to pull up the scriptures on your iPhone. Just don't text your neighbor and tell them the answer. 14:1. This is right after, or right as the Last Supper is kind of ending. And in the end of John 13, Jesus has just told everybody, hey, Peter's about to deny me. So these guys are kind of freaking out. His disciples they're not understanding things. They're nervous. Verse 1. He says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? He's using all kinds of imagery. Look, in about a week, these guys, it's all going to make a lot of sense. Right now they're going, I don't know what he's talking about. But he's like, listen, I'm telling you this because you need to know it. I wouldn't tell you that I'm going away if it weren't for the fact that I'm going to make these rooms for you, or that you are the room is really what's going on. Verse 3, and if I go to prepare a place for you, I'm going to come back. I'm going to take you to myself, and there where I am, you may be also. Verse 4. And you know the way to where I'm going. Now here's Thomas. Thomas speaks up, one of the disciples. He says, Lord, we don't know where you're going. Can you imagine the confusion at the time? How can we know the way? And look at what Jesus says. Jesus said to him, I am the way. I'm the truth. I'm the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And if you had known me, then you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. What's Jesus doing? He's telling us the biggest thing we need to know first is that Jesus is God. He's revealing God to us, but in such a way that he's saying, look, I am God. If you've seen me, you've seen my Father. If you know my Father, you know me. We're one and the same. It's a concept that was really new to them. You think, what do you mean it's new? See, so I thought this was the Bible. I thought this was all heading the same direction. It is. But if you've ever read the Old Testament or studied or heard stories, God did big things. He showed up in certain ways, right? He showed up in a pillar of fire at various times. He showed up in a big cloud of smoke at other times. He showed up in miraculous ways, in wind. He showed up in tangible ways at the temple. At the temple was a place called the Holy of Holies in the very center. And by the way, there was only one place that was the temple where God would go into the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies is where God's presence was supposed to be. It was a tangible place. And the priest who would go in there, they could only go in there one day a year. And as they went in, they had to take certain precautions. They had to go through certain rituals. And one of the rituals was they actually tied a rope to themselves. And they had little bells, tassels at the end of their robes. And if at any point in time you didn't hear the bells jingling anymore, like maybe God struck this priest dead for some reason because he didn't follow all the rules, then you would take the rope and pull him out. Scary. I have never read a story that says that happened, but I mean, that's what they did. So these guys are thinking that God is very tangible. Now add to that the Roman culture. You know much about the Roman culture. They had icons. They had all kinds of tangible images of their God. So when Jesus shows up and he says, I am the Father, and the Father and I are one, he's revealing something. He's making it tangible. But there's still a problem. Let me keep going. I want you to go to John 4. Jesus has a conversation now with this woman. She's at this well. She's Samaritan, which means that she's kind of a mix of a Jewish person and somebody else. And what's going to happen here is they're going to have a conversation about spirituality. So there's more to the story, but I want you to think there for now. John 4, verse 19. The woman says to Jesus, Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. She says that because he's telling her a lot of things about her life that he shouldn't know. Verse 20, she says, Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. She says, look, our teachers, they tell us we should worship here on this mountain, but you're Jewish, and the Jewish teachers say it's over at the temple, a different place. So what's the story? Jesus says to the woman, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. He said there's this day coming where you're going to stop associating worship of my Father with a tangible place. That something is about to be made known, and part of the reason it can be made known is because of what I'm about to tell you. He said, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. That's simply a commentary. He's saying, you're worshiping, but really you don't know everything because you guys have kind of blended what we know about God. And originally God came to the Jews first and he taught us. So we're both have these things that we're dealing with in verse 23, but the hour is coming and now is here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. Verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship must worship in spirit and truth. Second thing Jesus says. First he says, I'm God. Then he says, God is spirit. See, when Jesus showed up, he solved the problem that God had. You think, wait a minute, God has a problem. Well, yeah. The problem is this: God is spirit. And how does he communicate to those of us in the tangible world, right? Did anybody wake up this morning and you had to go, oh, wait a minute, I was out of my body, I got to get back into the world because like I just floated out for a second and now maybe it was just a dream, maybe you had a rough night, but that's not reality, right? We live in a tangible world. We're physical beings. We deal in a physical, tangible world. Now, we have spirit, we have personality, we have these things that are intangible to some degree. But God is spirit. He created the physical, he created the tangible, but he's spirit. And how does spirit communicate if spirit doesn't have a body? And Jesus was the answer to that. So, Jesus is God, and God is spirit, and that is how he began to solve his problem. Now go to Matthew 6. There's one more thing I want you to notice. Because I think these three things, if you understand this truth about God, I think it's the beginning of a path to knowing him more, and I think it's the beginning of us even being able to trust him. Matthew 6, verse 5. When you pray, Jesus is talking to his disciples, some people around him, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. It says, truly I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, pray to your Father in secret, and your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do. He's describing something here. Do you know this person? Everybody's got one of these in your life. You know the person that just talks? The person that just like talks about themselves, talks about the weather, they just can't stop talking. Like they absolutely love to hear themselves talk. Jesus is saying, you don't have to do that with God. You don't have to do that with me. Go in the room, go in secret, shut the door. Now verse 8, do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask. And then he says some big words. This is changing everything. Pray then like this, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Our Father, Jesus is God, God is spirit, and God is relational. God is relational. Look, I get it. Some of us, we didn't have good fathers. And even this conversation just makes you nervous, right? It makes your palms sweat a little bit. You break out. I get it. Not everybody has that good father understanding. But this is Jesus' way of helping us understand God is relational. He wants to walk with you. He wants to talk with you. He wants to commune with you. He wants to have relationship with you. It's more than just taking an offering somewhere and dropping it off. It's more than just going to a tangible place of worship, right? To seeing a statue of some God and dropping off whatever it is you got to drop off in the offering plate. This is a relationship. This changed everything. Because now instead of just talking, trying to sound smart, right? The conversation is not driven by how smart I need to sound, right? Or how much I want to be noticed. The conversation is now driven by me talking to my Father. By me going in a room, shutting the door, and speaking as if he was in the room, because you know what? He's in the room. He's spirit. And this is a truth that we've lost. And so the woman at the well, they're arguing about, well, do we worship here or do we worship here? And Jesus says, no. You got to understand God is spirit. I am God. God is spirit, and he's relational. And that's what he wants. He wants to have relationship with you. So this tangible person, Jesus Christ, is God first, right? But begins to help us understand God is spirit and that he is relational, that he wants to be in relationship with us. But remember what I said at the beginning. If we're confused about what we believe, it's gonna change how we describe what we believe. So for those of us, if you haven't gotten to that point, if you don't understand these things, then when our faith comes up or when somebody challenges us on what we believe, it's hard to respond with truth. Right? It's hard to respond with any confidence about God if you haven't come to know God. So sometimes this fake news thing about Christianity, this that God is not real, it seems so easy because he is spirit, and you don't get to get up every morning and see him, right? But yet if you can get to know him, if you can get to trust what we have written about him, if you can get to know him in this way, then he becomes real. We're not bringing the imaginary, we're not pulling a wish out of the air here. It's having our eyes open, right? And when this happens, here's what happens. You can then begin to describe what we believe about God, about the truth about God. We can do that, and we'll begin to rely on him, and we'll begin to rest in him. When you come to these understandings, you can rely on him a lot easier. You can rest in him a lot more. Right? We were flying in from Nashville this week, and of course the storms in Dallas made things a lot bumpy. And it's funny, not funny, to watch people on an airplane when a plane starts to kind of move all over the place. I don't know if you fly a lot, but when a plane starts to drop 50 feet or whatever it does and bounce, and the wings are bouncing, and the tail section is going sideways when you're trying to land, it seems like everybody, all of a sudden everybody prays at that point, right? Like everybody's praying at that point. I could have stood up and given a sermon, but the reality is that's desperation. It's not relationship. At that moment, nobody's really relying on God. Nobody's really resting on God. You're just helpless to the plane. The plane is moving you everywhere. To the believer, though, and hang with me, I know this is hard for some of you, but to the believer in a plane that's moving everywhere, you actually can rely on God and you can rest in him. You say, but what about when the plane crashes? You can still rely on him and rest in him. It just isn't always the best outcome or the outcome we want, right? But you can rely on him and you can rest in him if you have that relationship. If you don't, then you're simply screaming inside. It's desperation. As I was thinking this through this week, it reminded me of a passage, Hebrews 6, and I'm actually going to put it on the screen from the New Living Translation. Paul's writing, he says, so God's given both his promise and his oath. God's ponied up here. He's ponied up and he says, he's come through on his promise and his oath, and here's what he said. These two things are unchangeable because it is impossible for God to lie. Paul says, look, he's come through, and here's why I believe him, because first of all, he can't even lie, because he's God. That's what I've come to believe. Therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge, if you have a relationship, can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. This hope, watch this, is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. You ever seen a boat anchored along the shoreline when a storm's coming? The anchor doesn't actually keep the boat from getting rocked. The anchor keeps it from rocking into other things. The anchor holds it in a safe place even though it's getting knocked around, right? When you enter that relationship, when you come to that truth that Jesus is God, that he is spirit, so we have to know him, learn about him, dive in different ways. We can't just go to a lab somewhere, run some tests, and get to know God that way. That's not how he works. But he is relational too. And when you're willing to walk, when you come to that place of surrender, you say, not just desperation of God, if you're out there, right? And then the next second you just walk off the plane because you landed safely. Oh yeah, whatever. But when you say, no, let's walk together, I'm willing to go there, and you enter that relationship, then you have that anchor. You can be tossed around, but you can still rest in him. You can rely on him. So the question really for the week is, what do you anchor your soul in? What do you anchor your life in? You've already answered it for the past week. Okay, forget the past week. It's gone. It's over. You say, well, I messed up. It's okay. It's gone. It's over. What do you anchor your soul in this week? What are you going to anchor your soul in? Are you ready to take that step? Are you ready to invest in that relationship? To finally come up and say, look, I've got nothing else, right? It's like I'm on a plane and I'm just being tossed about. Are you ready to understand that God has revealed himself physically through the person of Jesus Christ, and that it's not fake news? But by believing these other things, it becomes fake news for some of us, right? You got to go back to a source. You got to have a source of some kind. Are you willing to walk with Him, trusting the source this week, which you can give it a chance? Let me pray for us.